I'm Bill Kassel, and this is Free Expression. This program is all about conveying the Christian message from a Catholic point of view and defending the liberty which makes it possible to do that. We peek at a new novel about what might be the second coming, and we trace a unique faith journey from Baptist to the Messianic movement to the Catholic Church. Join us, sit back and enjoy some free expression. Tragedies of history was the divergence of Christianity and Judaism. Jesus said he wished that all might be one, and yet the two great religious traditions, both springing from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, moved in two very different directions. Much misunderstanding, conflict, and suffering have come as a result. The Messianic movement is often seen as a bridge between the two faiths, focusing on the Jewishness of Jesus and offering a style of worship that celebrates Christ the Messiah in expressions of traditional Judaica. Many people are drawn to that blending. One is my guest, Dr. Matthew Wiseman. A scholar of religion, Dr. Wiseman made a spiritual journey from Protestantism to the Messianic movement and ultimately to Catholicism. That quest paralleled a physical journey that took him to far-flung locations around the world. His unique pilgrimage is documented in a book from Ignatius Press, The Two Jerusalems, My Conversion from the Messianic Movement to the Catholic Church. Matthew, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you would, please give us a little thumbnail of that faith journey.
Sure. For the first 11 years of my life, we were Southern Baptists, very typical and traditional West Texans. And around that time, we started doing church at home and discovered through some friends, we were introduced to the liturgical calendar of the Old Testament. We began observing those feasts as a way of commemorating the life of Christ. As we studied more, we realized that those were just part of a system, of a whole system of the religious life that God gave to Moses. And so we began to keep the other laws of the Old Testament, observe things like kosher food and laws of ritual purity and things like that. But there were conflicts within the community about how to interpret and apply those laws. What became clear to us pretty quickly was that there needed to be an interpretive tradition. You had to have some authority that could resolve these disputes, these differences of opinion among believers so that we could have a communal life. And so for about 4 or 5 years, we began to study Jewish oral tradition, what's called the Oral Torah, which is the accompanying interpretive tradition that helps the Jewish people to apply the law of Moses to their lives.
When you say we, are you talking about your entire church congregation or a group within it or your family or what?
There were several different groups and congregations out in West Texas where I was growing up. And some of them inclined more towards a traditional Protestant view. They believed in sola scriptura, and while they tried to observe the law of Moses, they applied it entirely through sort of private interpretation with plus, historical research.
Right.
And then there were other congregations, and this was the direction that my family went, that embraced Jewish tradition as authoritative to some extent or another. And the extent really varied from individual to individual and group to group. Some used it merely as sort of a resource, and others of us treated it more as an authority that had some kind of binding force.
Did you affiliate with one of the established Messianic groups, Jews for Jesus or such thing?
The congregation that we eventually gravitated toward was a Messianic synagogue which was part of essentially a denomination, a Messianic denomination, essentially. And there were a few of those around, but they were pretty loose, and generally their statements of faith were very limited because there was a lot of difference of opinion from congregation to congregation.
Do Messianics consider themselves Christians with a kind of Jewish outlook, or do they consider themselves Jews that accept Christ as a Savior? What's the perspective?
When you talk about what Messianics believe, there's almost never one answer. It's a very decentralized movement, and so there's a lot of disagreement. There are Messianics, people generally who would describe themselves as Hebrew roots Christians, who think of themselves as Torah-observant Christians. The direction that we gravitated in my family was towards viewing ourselves as members of Judaism who believed that Jesus was the Messiah.
Okay.
But there's no one group, and when we began, we were more of the other opinion. We were more thought of ourselves as Torah-observant Christians. But then eventually we gravitated more towards this thoroughgoing Jewish perspective.
I've observed that there's a kind of a two-way movement. There are people like yourselves who move from Christianity into the movement, and then there are Jews who move from the other direction, some of whom eventually become Christians. On the Jewish side, there's a good deal of distrust, I know. A lot of Jews look at the Messianic movement as just kind of a Trojan horse, a cover for pulling Jews away from Judaism. Did you feel this kind of suspicion or conflict when you were involved?
That was certainly, there was a large element of that. If you trace the origins of Messianic Judaism, of the Messianic movement, it goes back to the 19th century to something called the Hebrew Christian movement, which was essentially trying to create a place for Jewish converts to Christianity to keep elements of Jewish culture which were thought of as compatible with the Christian faith. So when you talk about organizations like Jews for Jesus that have a significant history, most of those are organizations for Jewish Christians who maintain their culture. Mm-hmm. In the wake of the Jesus movement, you got more things like what my family was involved in, where you had Gentile Christians who believed that even they were required to keep the law of Moses in its entirety in order to be Christians, in order to be followers of Jesus.
But there came a point where, I guess, you began to question that movement, and ultimately you turned to the Catholic Church. How did that happen?
Well, there was always a tension in a few ways. There were unresolved questions that we had. One of them was about this authority that the tradition needed to have, because it needed to be able to trump individual opinions. Otherwise, we could never come to agreements on once we got dug in. But on the other hand, Jesus didn't always seem to agree with the oral tradition, and he very clearly has respect for the Pharisees. He tells the people to listen to what they say because they sit in Moses' seat. They sit in the seat of authority. But he also makes it pretty clear that he believes they've abused their authority. Makes no bones about disagreeing with them when they've done so. And so there was a tension here. If we followed the oral tradition, which we needed in order to have agreement, then what did we do in instances where Jesus disagreed with that oral tradition? And there wasn't a simple answer to that question. The other real tension was a question about our identity. Who are we? Are we Jews? Are we Gentiles? Are we members of the 10 northern tribes, that are famously lost to history, the 10 northern tribes of Israel? And there was a lot of discussion at the time about what our relationship as people who were, ethnic Gentiles to the Jewish people. And there wasn't an obvious solution because the law and the oral tradition made it very clear that this was given to Israel proper, to ethnic Israel. We weren't part of that, and we were distinctly kept on the outside by mainstream Judaism. And yet St. Paul also made it clear that there were Gentiles and Jews and that they were unified. We didn't really know what to do with all of that. We didn't know how to make sense of that combination of facts. And that was the question that ultimately led me to leave the Messianic movement. I was on a break from college over the summer, and I went home, and we had a group of people come to the synagogue to give their presentation on how they thought they could resolve that question. Their idea was essentially that ethnic Jews were required to keep the law of Moses and that Gentiles were invited to. They were invited to participate, but not required to. To me, that seemed obviously to contradict the New Testament's approach, that the New Testament was about breaking down these distinctions, about unifying the two. And so this was a group that I really respected. And when I left that meeting, I sort of went, if that's the best answer that we have to this question, then we really don't have an answer.
But why the Catholic Church per se?
What the experience of the Messianic movement had taught me was that there needed to be a tradition and that it had to have the power to trump my opinion. I first went to the Anglicans. It was much more comfortable. One of the things that I knew for sure was that Catholicism was pagan, that everything, all of the rites and prayers and everything and all of the holidays of Catholicism were definitely pagan.
Right.
And it was much more comfortable to go into an Anglican church where, you know, there was stained glass, but there were fewer statues, and it was a little bit, it felt less pagan coming from a Jewish background.
Catholic light.
Yes, Catholic light. It was I think for me it was really a necessary transitional stage. It really helped ease the change. What I eventually realized reading St. John Henry Newman and watching, this was in 2010s, and the Anglican Communion was in the throes of a schism because they couldn't come to an agreement, and there was no one who had the authority to make them come to an agreement. And the tradition, it was ultimately held as a kind of aid to interpreting Scripture. It was helpful, but it wasn't authoritative over your personal understanding. It didn't really have the power to do what was necessary. I was watching the same things that happened in my little Messianic community out in West Texas happening on a global scale in the Anglican Communion. And that ultimately led me to the conclusion that Newman was right, that if there's no person, if there's no individual who is a guarantor of revelation, if there's no place where the buck stops, absolutely.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be used often, but the mechanism has to be there. Then we don't really have what St. Newman says is that if we don't have that mechanism, then there is no revelation. God hasn't revealed anything because everything is up for discussion.
What about the physical side of this? You did a lot of traveling and physical searching while this was going on.
I did. I took 2 trips to Israel. I studied in Germany and traveled to Poland to see the Noski Synagogue, the only house of worship in Warsaw that survived the Second World War. And those were all very enriching experiences. It was often eye-opening to get to see the places where things happened, the places where, you know, where the patriarchs and the prophets and Jesus lived. But I tend to live in my head. There were good adventures along the way, but the places were not the big influence on my conversion ultimately. They were wonderful experiences, and I try to work a lot of them into the book because they are sort of exciting and they add a lot of flavor and they're very interesting. I met some strange people of dubious character and some who were just wonderful folks. There was a gentleman that we knew who lived in Jerusalem when I was growing up, and his whole profession was about restoring biblical customs, restoring customs from the Second Temple period in particular. And he was a Levite. You would go to his apartment, and he had artifacts both Roman Israel and from ancient Israel before. He reconstructed biblical garments in his house. He had a money box that he had made like they had in the temple. When he first started doing it, he kept it in his house, and eventually he had to move it to a bank for safekeeping. But it was a museum, but in this guy's house. It was amazing.
When did you ultimately join the Catholic Church?
I ultimately joined the Catholic Church about 7 years ago now at Easter. It'll be 8 years this Easter. Having become convinced that the Anglicans didn't have a solution to my problem of how to interpret the Bible and still have unity. There was really only one option as far as I could see, because it didn't seem like the Orthodox were really doing any better. It was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church alone had unity. And so I left my Anglican parish, and by this time I was married and signed up for RCIA. And my wife was a little bit unsure about it. She didn't really have these questions. She didn't understand at the time why I wanted to become Catholic. While that was going on, we ended up actually moving. I had been working on my master's in North Carolina, and we ended up moving to Scotland for my PhD. And we had to mid-year sort of switch, and our RCIA, our confirmation, got delayed because we were moving from one place to another. It actually worked out the best way possible because my wife was teaching in the evenings, and she couldn't make it to the RCIA classes. And so our parish priest said, well, y'all talk about it at home, and we'll work out a way for her to get the education. Basically, she just started reading through the catechism from front to back. And by the time she got about halfway through, she went, this makes so much more sense than Protestantism, and I think I want to be Catholic too.
On the evangelical side, there is a tremendous amount of interest in Judaism and in the state of Israel. Since the death of Pope St. John Paul, on the Catholic side, not so much. At least that's my perception. Do you find that to be the case? I
think you're right. There is still some interest. There's still the Association of Hebrew Catholics, a great bunch of folks. Other than that, though, it really depends, I find, on the political leanings of the individual Catholic as to whether or not they're interested in Israel. In America, conservatives tend to have a strong interest in Israel, but it's more political than sort of historical and religious.
Yeah, it's more of a strategic concern, I think.
Yes.
Well, tell us about the book. Where can people learn more about it and possibly purchase it?
Well, you can find the book on Ignatius.com under the title The Two Jerusalems. It's also available from Amazon and from Barnes & Noble and most major booksellers online. Hopefully it's in your local Catholic bookstore, but I can't vouch for each location.
Matthew Wiseman, The Two Jerusalems, My Conversion from the Messianic Movement to the Catholic Church. You certainly have made a fascinating personal journey. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Since the discovery of DNA and the development of cloning technology, people have been captivated by the idea of cloning the blood residue on the Shroud of Turin or the product of various Eucharistic miracles. What would happen if we cloned Jesus? Would doing that be the second coming? Would it be the end of days? Such intriguing questions are the basis for a new book series by law professor and author Anthony Barone Kolenc. He's been with us before discussing his Harwood Mysteries, a young adult book series set in medieval England. Well, he's advanced in time, up to the present era, in fact, with a new literary undertaking, the Incarnate series, and he's with us now. Tony, good to speak to you again.
Bill, thanks so much for having me back on.
Well, hey, tell us about this new literary creation of yours.
Yeah, I've been working on this for about 7 years, and it was a scary idea when I first started thinking about it. Like you said in your intro, I don't know if I was praying one day or whatever, but I was thinking about Eucharistic miracles a lot. And like you said, cloning is so big nowadays. You hear so much about these things. And I thought, what would happen if you cloned a Eucharistic miracle? Like, who would want to do that? That's such a diabolical thing to do. So surely nobody good would want to do that. And why would they do that? And from those sort of initial kind of musings, I got the premise of what is now the Incarnate series, which is going to be a trilogy coming out from Chrism Press. It'll be out over the next 3 years. Book 1 is called Incarnate, and that's available. But it is I needed to go with a Catholic publisher for this kind of concept, because it was a little scary thinking about how blasphemous such an idea could be, like, to actually clone Jesus. So I said, all right, who would be my protagonist? It's got to be the person who's been cloned. And what would happen if you discovered, as a high school teenager about to graduate from senior year, and a secret agent shows up at your door, essentially, from a government agency, telling you that your life is in danger because you are something special. And next thing you know, all heck breaks loose, and this boy Joshua, who's actually been raised in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, learns that he is supposedly the clone of Jesus. And so Joshua and Rachel, those are my two main characters, kind of go on this adventure in Book 1 where there's a lot of people who are after them, but especially after Joshua. And, we could talk more about what this kind of story allows you to do, but it really, I think, is a exhilarating way to just explore some of the questions that surround the natures of Christ.
Yeah, well, it certainly raises a lot of interesting questions about the character. How would someone feel if suddenly they were given this information? Does he believe it?
It's a very strange story, and it's for adults, obviously older teens. It's not like my Harvard Mystery series, which is, middle and high school.
Right.
This is definitely older. When I started thinking about it, I was like, okay, so obviously whoever created him as this clone had some sort of nefarious purpose for him, because why else would you do this?
Right.
So you've got those guys who are trying to exploit what they've created. And then I was thinking, but if you were like the government, and of course we all like these government agency conspiracy theories, and you had somebody who potentially could have the powers of Christ or something like that, that might interest a secret government agency perhaps. And then if you were a Christian, maybe a particularly zealous pastor, and then you found out about this, you might think this is an abomination that needs to be destroyed. So Book 1 is sort of Joshua having to deal with all these different people from different perspectives who view him either as, the coming Antichrist or as something that should be worshipped, perhaps, as the second coming of Christ. And it really allows him to go on a lot of very odd but hopefully exciting adventures for the reader.
Yeah, I can see all kinds of interesting Da Vinci Code-style twists and turns in a premise
but
like
without,
this.
But without all of the anti-Catholicism of the Da Vinci
right.
Code, I must add, quickly.
Yeah. I guess Eucharistic miracles are something that elicits strong feelings. Either people reject them as superstitious nonsense or they embrace them as testaments to the faith. There is some scientific validity here. A lot of these things have been studied closely, and I guess they can't all be explained in normal terms.
When I started doing the research for this, I think I started getting the idea maybe when, was it Carlo Acutis who had the Eucharistic miracle displays going around the world that he had I think, been kind of the driving force behind that. That's when I first started learning about Eucharistic miracles. And the one that interested me the most, maybe, was in Italy, in Lanciano, which is actually not that far from Padre Pio's San Giovanni Rotunda. And I know this because a few years ago I took my mom on a little Italian trip, and we rented a car and drove up the coast, and that was one of the places I wanted to visit because I had already written a draft of Incarnate, and I was like, I want to go to Lanciano and see this Eucharistic miracle myself because it's the most studied Eucharistic miracle. It had scientists looking at it for at least since the 1970s. There were tests run on it. And so it was really fascinating to see. But there's been a lot of even more modern Eucharistic miracles, or at least alleged miracles. Not, I guess, like you said, it's controversial. There are some who might say they're not true, but there are some things that are very hard to explain, and there's a lot of coincidences between the miracles in, like, the blood type of, you talked about the Shroud of Turin in your intro also. The blood type on the shroud is the same blood type in Lanciano,
right,
and the same blood type in some of these other miracles. Some really interesting things like that.
Well, they're thought-provoking at the very least. Are they accepted by the Church?
Well, definitely some of them are, because in Lanciano, that is definitely one where I'm sure the bishops in that area approved it. I mean, that goes back to the 800, I think, is when that occurred or something. It was, very medieval. I'm not so sure, honestly, about the official Vatican position on any particular miracle, but if there was one that was ever going to be accepted, it would be Lanciano.
Well, I assume you have this thing well underway. The first one is all put together. Are you working on the subsequent entries in the series?
As we speak, I'm making my final edits to Book 2, which is due to the publisher very soon, and then this summer I'll be writing Book 3. So I think we're going to try to release them February 25, 26, and 27. And again, Chrism Press is a very Catholic, very good publisher, but they're small, and they like to publish sort of oddball things. They've got some speculative fiction out there and all sorts of things. They have contemporary romances, but they've got, I think, one that involves like a Franciscan werewolf or something. So they've got some oddball things. So when I was thinking, well, who could possibly publish this that would be a trustworthy Catholic publisher, but would also not just be like, what? It just so happened Chrism Press was the right one. They've had priests review it, and theologians look at it and try to make sure that there's not going to be anything in there that would be contrary to the Catholic faith.
Well, it's a great premise with all kinds of possibilities. Where can people find out about it? I assume there's a website.
Sure. Chrism Press is CHRISM, Chrism Press. You can get the book through there. Of course, if you just Google my last name, Kolenc, Kolenc, you'll find it at Amazon with my other stuff. But it'll be available. It's hard copy and ebook, and it'll be available, pretty much anywhere you'd want to find it.
Anthony Barone Kolenc. Hey, thanks very much for taking time to talk about this. It sounds like it's an exciting book with many, many great possibilities. I look forward to seeing what happens with it.
Thank you so much, Bill. I appreciate it, and I hope your readers will give it a chance.
Be with us next time when we explore other aspects of religious communication and look deeper into the great Christian heritage of free expression. Free Expression with Bill Kassel is a production of Good Shepherd Catholic Radio and Company Publications, where good books, good music, and good radio are always good company. Dan Curris provided technical assistance. Theme and incidental music are by Dan Adam. The program was produced and directed by Bill Kassel. This is Good Shepherd Catholic Radio.